The studio lights were bright, the cameras were rolling, and the audience was buzzing with excitement. It was one of those talk shows where every little moment felt alive, where people laughed, clapped, and waited for the kind of stories that stayed in their minds long after the credits rolled. That night, the special guests were two names everyone knew, Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock. The moment their names were announced, the crowd stood up with cheers and applause that lasted far longer than usual. It was clear that these two stars had a special place in the hearts of the people watching. Sandra walked in first, radiant in her elegant but simple dress, smiling warmly at the host and waving to the audience. Right behind her was Keanu, calm, composed, and as effortlessly cool as people had come to expect. When the two of them hugged, the crowd erupted again, almost as if they were seeing old friends reunited after years apart. The energy was real, and the host, trying to calm things down with a playful grin, said, "Looks like I don't even need to be here tonight. You two could run this show on your own." The audience laughed, but in truth, there was something magnetic about the pair that made it feel that way. Once they were seated, the host started with the obvious question. "So, let's talk about Speed," he said, referring to the blockbuster movie they had starred in together decades ago. "Do you guys ever get tired of people bringing it up?" Sandra laughed first, shaking her head slightly. "No," she said, "I think that movie gave me more than I ever expected. It was like stepping into another world." She turned toward Keanu, adding, "And honestly, I couldn't have asked for a better partner to go through it with." Keanu smiled gently, giving a small nod, as if agreeing but not needing to add anything yet. The host pressed further, asking them to share some behind-the-scenes stories. Sandra leaned forward, her eyes sparkling with humor. She began telling the audience about the long days on set, about how she had been nervous and inexperienced with big action sequences, and about how Keanu had somehow always managed to make things easier. She described how calm he was, how he never once raised his voice, and how his presence alone made her feel that she could handle the pressure. As she spoke, the audience listened with warmth, enjoying the way she blended humor with sincerity. Keanu, sitting quietly, added only small details here and there, like how Sandra had made everyone laugh on set with her quick jokes or how she managed to stay upbeat even when things went wrong. His voice was steady and kind, never once turning the focus to himself, but instead lifting Sandra up with every sentence. It was clear he had no desire to outshine her, and maybe that was why the audience loved him all the more. The host, sensing the playful chemistry, decided to stir the pot a little. "Okay," he said, leaning forward with a grin, "I have to ask. Everyone always says you two had incredible chemistry on screen. Tell me honestly, was that just acting, or was there something more?" The crowd gasped and then laughed, clapping loudly, waiting for an answer. Sandra blushed slightly, tilting her head with a shy smile. "Oh, come on," she said, trying to dodge the question. "We were just doing our jobs." Keanu chuckled softly but didn't say much, which only made the audience lean in closer. Sandra, perhaps feeling the pressure of the moment, decided to admit something. She told the host and the audience how, during the filming of Speed, she had a huge crush on Keanu but never said anything. The crowd exploded with laughter and applause, while the host's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "You did?" he asked. Sandra nodded, laughing at herself. "Yes, but I never told him. I thought he probably didn't feel the same way, so I just kept it to myself." The audience loved her honesty, and the laughter in the room grew louder, turning into whistles and claps. Keanu, sitting next to her, smiled calmly, his eyes twinkling but his expression unreadable. He gave no immediate response, letting the audience soak in Sandra's confession. The host, clearly having fun, teased them both. "So, Keanu, did you know this? Did you have any idea at all?" Keanu shook his head gently. "No," he said softly. I didn't. His answer was short, but it carried weight, and the audience reacted with surprise at his sincerity. The host then asked them to share more stories about their friendship, how they stayed in touch, and what it was like seeing each other again after so many years. Sandra spoke warmly about how, even though their careers had taken them in different directions, every time they met again, it felt like no time had passed. She described Keanu as the kind of person who never changed, no matter how famous he became, someone who remained grounded and kind. The conversation flowed easily, with Sandra's lively energy balancing Keanu's calm presence. They joked, teased each other, and filled the studio with laughter. Yet under all the humor, there was something deeper, a sense of respect and admiration that went beyond ordinary friendships in Hollywood. The host, noticing this, allowed the conversation to slow down, giving the pair room to share memories and reflections without rushing. For the audience, it was more than just an interview. It was a reunion of two beloved stars whose bond was visible in every glance, every smile, every word left unspoken. They had shared a piece of film history together, but what people saw that night was not just nostalgia. It was something genuine, something that made the room feel smaller, warmer, more personal. As part one of their story unfolded, the audience didn't feel like they were watching celebrities on a stage. They felt like they were witnessing two friends sharing their journey, reminding everyone that behind the lights and fame, there were real people with real connections. The laughter, the confessions, and the easy flow of their conversation set the perfect stage for what was to come. What no one knew yet was that Keanu was holding back something heartfelt, something that, when finally spoken, would leave the entire room in stunned silence. The audience was still buzzing with laughter after Sandra's open confession about having a crush on Keanu during the filming of Speed. The host leaned back in his chair with a wide smile, clearly enjoying the surprise that had just unfolded. But as the noise of the room began to settle, Sandra's voice grew softer, and her expression shifted from playful to reflective. She glanced at Keanu and then at the host, as if preparing herself to share something a little deeper. "You know," Sandra began, "people always ask me what that film meant to me, and of course it gave me my career, but it was more than that. I was new, nervous, and sometimes felt completely out of place. It was such a huge set, with so many eyes on me, and I wasn't sure if I could really do it." She paused, her smile becoming gentle. "But then I had Keanu next to me, and he made everything feel safe." The host raised his eyebrows with interest. "Safe? That's not a word most people think of when they picture a high-speed bus scene with explosions going off." The audience chuckled, and Sandra laughed too, but she nodded seriously. "Yes, safe. He never made me feel like I was less, even though I was learning everything as I went. He never treated me like a beginner. He made space for me, let me find my footing, and never once made me feel small. That's rare in this business." The audience clapped softly, touched by her words, and Keanu shifted in his chair, looking down for a moment before glancing back at her with a kind smile. He didn't interrupt, didn't try to downplay what she was saying. He just listened with that quiet focus he was known for. Sandra continued, her voice becoming livelier as she recounted specific memories. She told the story of how, on one of the hottest days on set, Keanu had shown up carrying water and snacks for the crew, not just for the stars, but for everyone: the lighting people, the camera team, the extras. She remembered how surprised she was to see the lead actor walking around, handing out bottles of water, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "That's who he was," Sandra said, her eyes glimmering. "That's who he still is. I learned a lot just by watching how he treated people." The audience responded warmly, many nodding in agreement, as though they had already suspected such stories about Keanu but were now delighted to hear them confirmed. The host leaned in, clearly fascinated. "So you're saying it wasn't just his acting that made an impression, it was him as a person?" Sandra nodded firmly. "Exactly. When you're young in this industry, it's easy to lose yourself, to feel like you have to prove you belong. But when you work with someone who treats you with respect from the start, it changes you. It gave me confidence I didn't have before. And to this day, I carry that with me. The studio grew quieter now, the energy shifting from playful laughter to thoughtful attention. The audience leaned forward, sensing they were hearing something real, something honest. Sandra smiled at Keanu, almost shyly, as though acknowledging something she had never said aloud in such a public way before. Keanu, as always, didn't jump in right away. He let the moment breathe, his calm presence giving Sandra's words the space they deserved. The host, however, wasn't about to let the silence linger too long. With a playful tone, he said, "Sandra, you're making it sound like he was your guardian angel on that set." The audience laughed again, but Sandra simply shrugged, still smiling. Maybe he was. At least, that's how it felt. The crowd erupted in applause at that line, clapping and cheering, while Keanu gave a small laugh, shaking his head slightly, though his expression showed he was touched. Sandra, encouraged by the reaction, went on to explain how Keanu's presence didn't just help her professionally but personally too. "You know," she said, "Hollywood can be very lonely, even when you're surrounded by people. But during that time, I felt like I had a real friend. We could laugh, we could share little things, and it felt normal, even though everything around us was so big and crazy." The host smiled warmly, sensing the depth of her emotions. "It sounds like you two built something that went beyond just a movie," he said. Sandra nodded, her voice soft. "Yes, we did. And it's something I'll always treasure." The audience clapped again, and many smiled as though they were part of something intimate, something rarely seen between Hollywood stars. It wasn't just about promoting a film or entertaining a crowd, it felt like a window into a friendship that had quietly lasted through the years. The host, eager to lighten the mood again, asked, "All right, Sandra, let's be honest, was there ever a moment you thought, maybe this could be more than friendship?" The crowd laughed and leaned forward, waiting for Sandra's reply. She laughed too, hiding her face in her hands for a moment before shaking her head. "Oh, you're terrible," she said to the host, then turned back to the audience. "I think everyone thought that, didn't they?" The audience roared with laughter and applause, and Sandra added, "But honestly, sometimes the best thing is to just keep a friendship as it is. And this one has always been special." The host nodded thoughtfully, while Keanu simply gave a quiet smile, his eyes fixed ahead, not betraying much but clearly present in the moment. The audience noticed his silence, and it only added to the sense that he had something to say but was waiting for the right time. As the conversation carried on, Sandra's stories painted a vivid picture of their time together. She described the long hours, the pressure and the chaos of shooting an action film, but also the laughter they shared during breaks, the silly jokes, and the way Keanu could make everyone relax even in the most stressful situations. She admitted that those memories had stayed with her for years, reminding her of the importance of kindness and patience. The audience seemed completely absorbed now, no longer restless or waiting for the next punchline. They were drawn into Sandra's words, into the picture of a young actress finding her strength with the quiet support of a co-star who had no need for attention or praise. It felt like more than a story about a movie set, it felt like a life lesson unfolding on stage. The host eventually leaned back, smiling, and said, "Well, Sandra, I think you've just given the world a whole new perspective on Keanu Reeves." The audience cheered in agreement, clapping loudly, while Keanu gave a humble smile, shaking his head slightly as if to downplay the praise. But the truth was clear in the room, Sandra's words had touched everyone. As the applause faded, the host turned to Keanu and said, "Now, I think it's only fair we hear your side of the story. Sandra's been singing your praises all night. What do you have to say about her?" The studio went quiet, every ear waiting for his response. Keanu leaned back slightly, thoughtful as always, his silence stretching just long enough to make the anticipation grow. No one knew what he was about to say, but everyone sensed that whatever it was, it would not be ordinary. And so, as part 2 came to a close, the stage was perfectly set. Sandra had spoken from her heart, sharing how much Keanu's presence had meant to her, and now all eyes turned to him. The host leaned forward, the audience held its breath, and Sandra herself looked at Keanu with curiosity, perhaps wondering if he would finally reveal what had been left unsaid for so many years. The studio was silent in a way that felt rare for a talk show. Usually, the sound of clapping, laughter, or cheering filled the air, but now the audience leaned forward, waiting for Keanu to speak. Sandra had spoken so openly and warmly about him, and the host had just placed the spotlight directly on him. Even Sandra herself seemed curious, her eyes resting on him with a quiet smile, as though she wasn't entirely sure what he might say. Keanu shifted slightly in his seat, his hands resting calmly on his lap. For a moment, he looked at the floor, then at Sandra, then back at the host. His expression was thoughtful, the kind of look that suggested he was carefully choosing his words. He wasn't the type to rush. Finally, in his steady, low voice, he began to speak. "You know," Keanu said, "I think people sometimes forget that movies aren't just about the action, the cameras, or the story. They're about the people you work with. And for me, Speed wasn't just another job. It was where I met Sandra." The audience reacted with soft applause, touched by the simplicity of his words. Sandra smiled, tilting her head as if to say she hadn't expected him to put it that way. Keanu continued, his tone calm but filled with meaning. "When I walked on that set, I knew it was going to be big. There was pressure everywhere. But then there was Sandra. She had this energy, this light that made everything different. She didn't just play a character, she lifted everyone's spirits. She made people laugh. She made the long days feel shorter. And to me, that meant more than anything else." The host raised his eyebrows, impressed, while the audience clapped again, this time louder. Sandra lowered her gaze for a moment, almost embarrassed, though her smile showed how much his words touched her. Keanu wasn't finished. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes focused on Sandra. "Sandra says I made her feel safe, but the truth is, she gave me something too. She reminded me of what it means to enjoy the work, to enjoy the little moments. She has this way of making people feel seen, and that's rare. It's not about fame, it's not about money, it's just who she is. And for me, that's unforgettable." The room grew quiet again, almost reverent. The host, for once, didn't jump in with a joke or a quick response. He seemed to sense that this was one of those rare moments where honesty spoke louder than anything else. Sandra looked at Keanu, her eyes soft, her smile no longer playful but deeply moved. The audience felt the shift too. This wasn't a scripted compliment or a rehearsed story. It was raw, heartfelt, and sincere. People in the crowd exchanged looks, as though they couldn't believe they were witnessing such a genuine exchange between two stars known more for their films than for their private feelings. Keanu paused for a moment, then added something unexpected. "You know, when people talk about chemistry on screen, they make it sound like magic. But the truth is, it only works if there's something real behind it. And with Sandra, it was always real. She's one of the most remarkable people I've ever met. Working with her wasn't just acting, it was sharing something honest." The audience gasped softly at his words, and the host put a hand over his mouth in surprise, almost as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Sandra laughed gently, shaking her head, though her cheeks flushed with color. "You're going to make me cry," she said softly, and the audience clapped warmly, many touched by the emotion in her voice. Keanu smiled faintly but didn't back away from the moment. Instead, he continued, his voice still steady but with a weight that carried through the room. The truth is, I've always admired Sandra. Not just as an actress, but as a person. She has this kindness that doesn't fade, no matter where she is or who she's with. And I think that's why people love her so much. It's not just about the roles she's played, it's about the person she is. The silence that followed was powerful. The audience didn't move, the host didn't speak, and even Sandra seemed taken aback. For a moment, it felt as though the entire world had slowed down to hear those words. Finally, the host found his voice, though it came out softer than before. "Wow," he said, shaking his head slightly. That was beautiful." The crowd erupted into applause, louder and longer than before, many people even standing up in appreciation. Keanu nodded politely, his usual calm demeanor unchanged, but there was a small warmth in his expression that revealed the depth of what he had just shared. Sandra, still smiling, leaned toward him and said softly, "I don't think anyone's ever said something like that to me on television." The audience reacted with an awe, and Keanu simply shrugged modestly, as though his words had been nothing special. But the truth was clear to everyone watching: they had just witnessed a rare and genuine moment of admiration, spoken without hesitation and without a trace of pretense. The host, regaining his energy, tried to lighten the mood again. "Well," he said with a grin, "I think you've just left me without a follow-up question. And that doesn't happen often." The audience laughed, but it was softer than before, as though they didn't want to disturb the atmosphere that had been created. Sandra, still glowing from Keanu's words, turned to the audience and said, "See, this is why people love him. He doesn't just say things to sound good. When he speaks, it's real. And you feel it." The audience cheered again, clapping and whistling, clearly agreeing. Keanu looked at her with a small smile, and for a brief second, it seemed like the two of them were in their own world, the noise of the studio fading away. It was a friendship that had stood the test of time, filled with respect and warmth, and in that moment, everyone watching could see it clearly. As the conversation continued, the host asked about their lives now, about what projects they were working on, and how they managed to stay grounded in Hollywood. But even as the questions changed, the energy in the room lingered from that moment. Everyone could still feel the weight of Keanu's words, still carried by the honesty and sincerity that had silenced the room only minutes before. The rest of the segment flowed with ease, but nothing could quite top that exchange. It became the highlight of the evening, the moment people would talk about the next day, the clip that would be shared again and again online. And through it all, Sandra and Keanu sat side by side, laughing, smiling, and reminding the world why their bond, both on screen and off, had become something truly special. What had started as a playful interview had turned into something deeper, a glimpse into the hearts of two people who had shared more than just a movie set. And though the night would go on, that one response from Keanu would remain etched in the memory of everyone present, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful words are the simplest ones, spoken with honesty. The studio had experienced many powerful moments over the years, but that evening felt different. Keanu's words still lingered in the air, almost like a gentle echo that refused to fade. Sandra's expression told the story more clearly than anything else. She was touched in a way that left her speechless, and the host, usually quick with his wit, found himself momentarily without a response. For several long seconds, silence wrapped around the room like a blanket. No one stirred, no one coughed, no one tried to break the stillness. It was as though everyone knew they had witnessed something rare, something real. The host shifted in his chair, his smile softer now, less like the playful grin he wore earlier and more like a look of respect. He cleared his throat, preparing to steer the conversation back to lighter ground, but before he could speak, Sandra leaned slightly forward, still looking at Keanu with an expression that mixed gratitude, surprise, and affection. "You always do this," she said quietly, though the microphone carried her words across the room. "You say so little, but when you do, it leaves people quiet. You leave me quiet. The audience reacted with a gentle wave of applause and laughter, though not the loud kind of laughter that breaks tension, but the warm laughter that acknowledges truth. Keanu gave one of his modest smiles, lowering his gaze as though embarrassed by the attention, which only made the audience adore him more. The host finally found his voice. "I have to admit," he said, chuckling, "this is the first time I've ever been completely out of words on my own show." The audience laughed louder this time, breaking the tension just enough to bring a wave of ease back into the room. Yet even with the laughter, that unforgettable silence still hung over them, reminding everyone of what had just happened. Sandra took a breath and leaned back in her seat, her eyes sparkling with a mix of humor and emotion. "Well," she said, "I think the host isn't the only one who's been left quiet tonight. You've got the whole room in your hands, Keanu." The audience clapped and cheered again, and Keanu gave a small shrug, still humble, still soft-spoken. The host leaned in, curious. "Sandra, how did it feel hearing that? I mean, you've been praised many times in your career, but that looked like it hit differently." Sandra paused, her expression turning thoughtful. "It did," she admitted. "Because it wasn't about my career or my success, it was about me as a person. That's what makes it different. In this industry, we often get praised for roles, for awards, for numbers. But to be seen for who you are, that's rare." The audience applauded again, many nodding in agreement, clearly touched by her honesty. Keanu sat quietly beside her, not interrupting, letting her have the space to share what was on her mind. His stillness only seemed to highlight the sincerity of the moment, as though he understood that some silences carried more meaning than words ever could. The host, sensing the emotion in the room, asked gently, "Do you think this is why your friendship has lasted so long? That ability to see each other beyond the work, beyond the fame?" Sandra nodded without hesitation. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly why. We've both had ups and downs in our lives, and we've both seen how this industry can change people. But somehow, when we meet, it's like none of that matters. It's just two people who shared a time, a memory, and a kind of understanding that doesn't fade." The audience clapped softly again, and some even wiped their eyes. The moment was no longer just entertainment, it was a reminder of the human side of two people often seen only as Hollywood stars. The silence that had fallen earlier became almost like a character in the story, revisited again and again. Every time the conversation drifted back toward humor or light banter, it circled back to that stillness, reminding everyone that they had witnessed something more powerful than scripted jokes or planned questions. The host, still marveling at the exchange, tried to lighten things again by saying, "Well, I don't know about the rest of you, but I think I just watched a scene that belongs in a movie." The audience laughed, clapped, and whistled, while Sandra shook her head with amusement. "If this goes into a movie," she teased, "I want to make sure I look good in the final cut." The laughter grew louder, giving the audience a moment to release the emotions they had been holding onto. Keanu, ever quiet but never absent, added softly, "You always do." The room erupted into cheers and applause once again, proving that even in a light-hearted comment, his words carried weight. Sandra covered her face with her hands for a second, laughing and shaking her head as though she didn't know how to handle the wave of affection from both Keanu and the audience. The host raised his hands dramatically, pretending to give up. "See? I don't even need to ask questions anymore. You two can just talk, and the rest of us will sit here and enjoy it." The crowd laughed, clapping louder, and for a while the studio was filled with energy again, balancing out the quietness from before. But the truth was, the moment of silence was the one that stayed with everyone. People would later describe it in different ways, some would say it was magical, others that it was emotional, and some even that it felt like watching two souls understand each other without needing to explain. Whatever the description, everyone agreed that it wasn't something that could be staged. It was authentic. Sandra, still smiling but now calmer, looked back at Keanu with eyes that seemed to carry both gratitude and curiosity. "You know," she said softly, "I think sometimes people underestimate you. They think they know who you are from the movies, from the interviews. But when you speak like this, it shows another side. And I'm really glad people get to see it." The audience clapped again, and Keanu gave his usual modest smile, almost as if he wanted to shrink away from the spotlight, but his silence only made him shine brighter. The host leaned back in his chair, finally taking a deep breath. "Well," he said, "I can tell you one thing, this conversation has turned into something I didn't expect. And I'm glad it did." The audience applauded again, many nodding as if they agreed completely. As the cameras continued to roll, the silence that had once filled the room now became a memory that everyone wanted to hold onto. It wasn't awkward or uncomfortable, it was powerful, the kind of silence that speaks louder than any words. It was the silence of admiration, of respect, and of a bond that was stronger than time. The segment was supposed to be another light-hearted Hollywood chat, filled with jokes, playful questions, and maybe a funny story or two. Instead, it had become a moment of truth, where two people revealed their genuine admiration for each other, and in doing so, reminded the world that sincerity was still possible in an industry often filled with pretense. As part 4 drew to a close, the audience still felt the weight of that silence in their hearts. They had seen the host speechless, Sandra moved to quiet smiles, and Keanu's words holding the power to stop a room full of people in their tracks. That kind of moment didn't just pass, it stayed, etched in memory. And though the show would continue, that silence would forever be remembered as the moment when words became unnecessary, because truth had already been spoken. The show moved on, but the moment remained. Even as the host tried to lighten the mood with new questions and playful jokes, everyone in the studio seemed to carry that silence with them, like a memory that refused to let go. Sandra smiled more gently now, her laughter softer, her glances toward Keanu filled with something deeper than casual friendship. And Keanu, true to himself, stayed calm and quiet, but his presence carried weight, as though every word he had spoken earlier still hung in the air. When the interview wrapped up, the audience gave them both a standing ovation. It wasn't just applause for two famous stars, it was gratitude for the authenticity they had shared. People clapped louder and longer than usual, and the cameras caught the faces of audience members who looked genuinely moved. For many, it didn't feel like a talk show anymore. It felt like they had been allowed into a private conversation, something sincere and unplanned. Backstage, the mood was still warm. Sandra leaned over to Keanu, touching his arm lightly. "You know you made the host speechless tonight, right?" she said with a playful grin. Keanu gave his small, modest smile, shaking his head. "I didn't mean to," he said quietly. Sandra laughed. "That's exactly why it worked." What happened next was beyond anything either of them had expected. When the episode aired, the clip of their exchange spread almost instantly. Within hours, it was being shared across social media, replayed by millions of people who couldn't believe what they had witnessed. The headlines all carried the same theme: what Keanu said to Sandra left everyone silent. People commented endlessly, writing about how refreshing it was to see two stars speak with such honesty and respect for one another. Fans from around the world shared their favorite parts. Some loved Sandra's candid confession about her crush, others replayed Keanu's calm but powerful words about her kindness, and many mentioned the silence, that unforgettable pause where the world seemed to stop. News outlets picked up the story, writing articles about their friendship, about the bond they shared, and about how rare it was to see something so genuine in Hollywood. The talk show host even admitted in an interview the next day that he had never been left so completely speechless in his career. "It wasn't just television," he said. "It was real. And that's why it hit so hard." For Keanu and Sandra, it was both surprising and humbling. They had gone into the interview expecting a light-hearted reunion, maybe a few laughs and some nostalgia. Instead, they had become the center of a worldwide conversation about authenticity, kindness, and respect. Sandra, in later interviews, admitted that she hadn't expected Keanu's words. "I thought we'd laugh about old times, maybe tell some funny stories. I didn't expect him to say what he did. And I'll be honest, it stayed with me." Keanu, on his part, downplayed the attention, as he often did. When asked about the moment, he simply said, "I just spoke the truth. Sandra's someone I admire, and I wanted her to know that." His modesty only made people love him more. The moment became a reminder that even in an industry often filled with rehearsed lines and carefully crafted images, honesty could still break through. Fans began sharing their own stories of how Keanu's words inspired them to speak kindly to the people they cared about, or how Sandra's openness reminded them of the importance of acknowledging those who made a difference in their lives. The clip didn't fade quickly like most viral moments. It lingered, replayed over and over, discussed in magazines, podcasts, and news programs. People weren't just entertained, they were moved. And in a world often hungry for sincerity, that single exchange between Keanu and Sandra felt like a gift. Sandra later said that what meant the most to her wasn't the attention, but the way people responded. "I had strangers coming up to me saying, 'That moment made me call my friend,' or, 'I told someone how much I appreciated them because of what I saw on that show.' If that's the impact it had, then it was worth it." Keanu, when asked about why he thought people reacted so strongly, paused in his usual thoughtful way before answering. "Maybe because we all need reminders," he said. "Reminders that kindness matters, that honesty matters. And maybe it just happened at the right time." The bond between Sandra and Keanu became a symbol of something rare. Fans began to call them the perfect example of friendship, of admiration without competition, of respect without pretense. They became, in the eyes of many, proof that Hollywood wasn't just about glamour and fame, it could also show genuine humanity. The talk show itself even replayed the moment in later episodes, calling it one of the highlights of the season. The host joked about how he had never recovered from being left speechless, but behind the humor, it was clear he felt honored to have been part of something so memorable. Months later, the story was still alive. Whenever Keanu or Sandra appeared in public, interviewers brought up that night. Fans posted clips with captions like, "This is what real respect looks like," or, "Find someone who talks about you the way Keanu talks about Sandra." It had become more than entertainment, it had become a lesson. For Sandra, it was a reminder of how much that time in her life had shaped her, and how the people you meet along the way can leave a permanent mark. For Keanu, it was simply another example of how his quiet honesty had touched people without him ever trying to make a spectacle of it. And for the world, it was an unforgettable moment of silence, the kind that speaks louder than sound. What began as a reunion interview turned into a story that would be remembered for years. Not because of gossip, not because of scandal, but because of kindness, honesty, and respect. Two people, sitting side by side, reminding everyone that sometimes the most powerful moments are the simplest ones. As the lights dimmed that night, and the cameras turned off, Sandra and Keanu shared a quiet smile, one that said more than words ever could. The host, still shaking his head with amazement, said softly, "I don't think I'll ever forget this one." And neither would anyone else who had watched. The story would live on, not just as a talk show clip, but as a memory of how one man's words, spoken with sincerity, left an entire room in silence, and how that silence carried far beyond the studio, into the hearts of millions.